这一场讲座。那事不宜迟，我们就请多能捞开始今天的这个分享。
好，谢谢嘉伟。
对，嘉伟，
谢谢你。So嘉伟 helped to put together this event. So thank you very much.
谢谢。
So I'm also very grateful to 友联 because when I self-published the English book, and then later when it was translated into Chinese by Cao Geng, by Grassroots, they were very eager to carry both. Every time I'm back in Singapore, I try to make it a point to do something here. So thank you very much for attending on a Monday evening, when start of the work week. I'm sure everybody's busy with Chinese New Year. So I thought last time when I spoke here, I spoke about Hong Kong and the Greater Bay Area, Dawanqu, and what might it say about the future of the Johor and Singapore special economic zone. So if you're interested in that topic, I think it's online. It's on Youlian's YouTube, or you have questions or comments about that issue, please feel free to raise them. Today I thought I'll talk about a different topic. Essentially, what is the Chinese government or the Chinese authorities thinking about when we talk about China's economic future, especially after COVID? So a lot of the things I will share comes from the book. So maybe I'll start by highlighting when I was putting together this book. This book is really a collection of commentaries I've written, from the start of COVID in February 2020 all the way to end of 2024. So it came out early 2025. So when I was putting together the book, I was struck by how many contradictions, 矛盾, right? Chinese still are communists, so they think in terms of contradictions. So I was struck by an incredible number of contradictions. Maybe I'll just highlight a couple. The first is we're constantly inundated with news about China's technological prowess, right? Jensen Huang, probably the leading technologist of our generation. There's no doubt now. There's no more contest, right? China has won the AI wars. Has already won, right? In fact, the running joke is the AI wars are really not between US and China, but between Chinese people in the US and Chinese people in China. And every time the Chinese announce some 5-year plan or some gathering of their National People's Congress or whatever, or the 2 sessions, it is invariably very tech-centric and I would argue techno-utopian. Right? They try to craft a vision that is full of technological innovations, right? So they primarily view economic development as technological development, technological progress. So on the one hand, you have all this excitement, right? I mean, in 2024, the buzzword of the Chinese government was something called 新质生产力, new quality productive forces. And what are 新质生产力? It's simply things like electric vehicles, robots, both industrial and increasingly household robots, lithium batteries, solar panels, UHV, ultra high voltage electricity grids. So really a very tech-centric and techno-utopian vision of their economic future. So on the one hand, you have this, state-led techno-utopianism. On the other hand, if you speak to Chinese people, not just among those less educated, but even highly qualified professionals, this is what they're talking about. How do I get out of China? In 2024, so when government was talking about 新质生产力, that's the government buzzword. The buzzword among society was this word called run, right? Why did they choose this word run? Because it sounds like run, right? Running away. So the Hanyu Ping of run is run. So in 2020, both in 2024 and as well as last year, guess which was the favored destination of these US. Chinese professionals? US. No longer the US, Japan. So last year, my friend, a journalist friend in Japan, published this book called Run Ru, Running to Japan. You go to Chinese internet, read their version of Reddit, or Twitter. I imagine millions of pages on something called 润学, the study of running. Whether it's so there's long conversations about going to Japan, there's long conversations about going to Singapore, Southeast Asia, and of course US, and so it's a paradox, right? You've got all these tech powers, all these very successful tech companies in China, and yet their professionals are so despondent, so pessimistic about China's economic prospects. Another paradox is, I'll highlight is this. China produces the most number of STEM graduates in the world, whether it's graduates or PhD, right? You look at PhDs, more than nearly 3 times the US's total. And of the US's total, American citizens are only about half of that. The other half is mostly Chinese and Indians. So that's why the joke, right? The AI war between China and US is really about Chinese people and China versus Chinese people in the US. So that's one, right? So the Chinese authorities look at this and say, this is proof of our technological leadership, right? The fact that we are world-beating, that we're creating all these future talents, we're churning all these future talents. On the other hand, this is the lived reality of the average urban Chinese worker, possibly even one with university education. Right? Last year, one of the best-selling books in China is this book that was the original title is in Chinese. 我在北京送快递. So it's been translated into English. So I read the English one, very good, highly recommended. If you already read my book, please buy this book. Right? And the economists reviewed it and say to make his desired salary of 7,000 yuan, which is only about 1,300 Singapore dollars, not high. I mean, in Singapore, it would be considered low income, right? He has to work 26 days a month, and each day 11 hours. Goodness, just to make what in Singapore we would consider barely living wage, right? He has to organize parcels, navigate across his area, and he only receives about 2 yuan per parcel. That's 40 cents, right? And so he's learned to see every minute as a potential half yuan. Going to the toilet would waste 1 yuan. Right? Having lunch would cost him 25 yuan in terms of time spent not delivering, right? He has learned to drink less water and also to skip lunch. That is the lived reality for 40% of China's urban workforce. Again, it is a paradox, right? All these highly qualified STEM graduates, but for a significant, not majority, but almost a majority of Chinese laborers, it is anything but high tech, right? So I thought it's interesting to highlight these two paradoxes. So even in the midst of trying to create this techno-utopia, there's a lot of collateral damage that is being generated, a lot of what economists would call externalities. Okay, so what I will try to do next is try to put together some of these key arguments in the book that describe China's techno-utopianism. Right? So they're trying to do this, they're trying to pivot or create a new economic model driven by technology and innovation and high productivity investments at a time when China is grappling with a lot of macroeconomic headwinds. And these macroeconomic challenges have been there for at least a decade. I mean, when Wen Jiabao stepped down, he highlighted 3 or 4 significant imbalances. And these imbalances are still very much in the Chinese economy. First, too little domestic consumption. Why? Because households are not earning a lot, right? They're earning on average about less than 10,000 yuan a month. Right? So too little domestic consumption, which means that the economy is very dependent on investment, right? There are only 3 or 4 sources of economic growth: household consumption, private investments, government spending, and net exports. So among all the major economies, or all the Asian economies, China is the world champion in terms of investments. You might think that's a great thing, right? Why should an investment-led growth model not be a good thing? And certainly, if you want to try to create a tech-intensive, technology-driven economy, investing in these new, what they call new quality productive forces, surely that is a good thing. But without households willing to consume, well, who are you producing all this for? And so, for all of last year, right, what were the Chinese authorities going on about? Right? They're trying to push exports. Why are they so obsessed about exports? Because there's not enough domestic demand. In fact, domestically, the challenge they face all of last year and still now is something they call 内卷, which is simply over excessive competition as a result of overcapacity. Why have they got this overcapacity problem? Because of excessive investment, right? Factories are operating only at about 70% capacity. In other words, they have a lot of sunk costs which are not being used, right? A lot of idle capacity. So this also shows, right, the extremely high dependence on investment and inadequate consumption. Chinese household consumption, depending on how you count it, is between 36 to 38% of GDP. The global average is about 60%. So, another metric to illustrate how little Chinese households consume is that China is about 18% of the world's population. Right? It is also about 18% of world's GDP. Its share of global manufacturing, you guess how much? The share of global manufacturing?
50%.
No, not so high.
50.
40.
No, about just slightly over 30, 32, 33. But it's still a lot. It's almost double China's share of the global economy. Its share of global consumption is only about 11%. Right? So one shorthand for remembering this is China overproduces relative to its share of the global economy and underconsumes. And of course, you can imagine the global implications of that, right? Which is they try to export all this spare capacity, and that's driving down prices. Great for consumers. If you're looking for a car, I highly recommend BYD. Right? Despite rising COE prices, this great car has not raised its prices because there's so much of. They're trying to get rid of all this spare capacity. I live in Hong Kong. In Singapore, I cannot afford a car. In Hong Kong, the BYD prices have come down by about 20,000 Sing, right, in just over a year and a half. So when I first looked at BYD in 2024, it was about 60,000 Sing, 50 to 60, because they also have taxes. Now it's about under 50, now it's about 45,000. So it's very affordable. I'm very tempted to buy one, except the parking will cost more than the car itself. So that is clearly not sustainable. Another chart to illustrate this is that not only is China very dependent on investment, it became even more dependent on investment at a time when growth was falling. So this blue line is GDP growth during and after the global financial crisis. So at a time of shrinking growth, they were doubling down on this investment-led model, which meant that they're using capital. Investment is simply investing capital, right? They're using capital less and less efficiently. So that's a sign of reduced efficiency. Right? So you're trying to create this techno-utopia, but it's not a very intelligent or very efficient way of investing. And the reason it's not very efficient is because who's buying all this stuff? Right? The profit margins of companies are very low. There's excess capacity. There's excessive competition. So it's not a particularly good use of capital. And the third problem with this investment-led model is that China's population is already shrinking, about 10 years ahead of what before UN demographers thought it would be around early 2030s, before China's population started shrinking. It started shrinking in 2022. China's workforce has already been shrinking since about 2014, 2015. So you have all this, capital that's now there's nothing wrong with saying we want to invest in these technologies and industries of the future. That's fantastic. That's a great ambition. I wish every government would do that. AI, sustainable energy, robots, right? But particularly for aging societies, we would need all that sort of investments. But so who? I mean, you would have to be really a nasty person to say, oh, China shouldn't invest in these. But the question is, there is no thinking about where's the consumption coming from, right? And because they don't think enough about consumption, they end up with problems like deflation, overcapacity, which they then have to export, right? And other countries, including Singapore, but especially the rest of Southeast Asia, face the onslaught of cheap Chinese goods. And the final problem with this investment-led model is it was heavily debt-driven. So when everybody every time I hear people say, "Oh, the Chinese economy is doing so well relative to the US is drowning in debt, it is printing money," I say, "What makes you think China is any different?" Right? You look at again at the time of the global financial crisis, China's total debt if you exclude the non-financial corporate, because this is just bank, sorry, if you exclude financial corporation, because it's just bank debt, this blue bar, it was about just under 200% of GDP, right? This was around the time of the global financial crisis. High by developing country standards, but not that unusual, right? Today, China's debt to GDP ratio is more than 300% of GDP. That is very high, right? In other developing countries, that would already have led to a cataclysmic financial crisis. At the time of the Asian financial crisis that Singaporeans are most familiar with, Southeast Asia's countries like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, their total debt to GDP ratio was only about 150 to 200% of GDP. China's is more than double that. So now, why hasn't it led to a severe financial crisis yet? Partly because the RMB is not international, right? Partly because most of the debt is held by Chinese households. So for instance, my favorite Chinese company is this company, not BYD, it's this company called Evergrande, right? Hengda, right? And then when Hengda declared bankruptcy, it had debt liabilities of $300 billion. That's 80% of Hong Kong's GDP. Just one property developer in Guangzhou has debt liabilities of $300 billion. So when Evergrande defaulted, who paid the price? Yeah, 老百姓, those who helped, right, who had lent to Evergrande, who bought Evergrande bonds, who had bought wealth management products. Evergrande's employees were forced to buy, right? So I always tell my Chinese students, here's one piece of financial advice from somebody who has seen it all before, right? Or seen many things before, who have eaten more salt than you have eaten rice, right? I'm not old enough to say shit like that. Let's tell them, right? If you are working for a company, please do not invest in that company, right? Why would you want to be exposed to, you're already at risk that this company will go under. On top of that, you want to lend to your company, you want to invest in your own. I mean, shares are a different thing, that's because the company gives you. But why would you take your discretionary savings and put it in your own company's wealth management product? So China has a debt bomb, right? Which it is. So the techno-utopia is partly a response to this, right? Because they think that for far too long now, for at least 20 years, too much of Chinese households' capital has been going to the wrong things, financing not particularly productive real estate, right? Creating all these ghost cities. My last trip to China in end of 2019, I drove a bit out of Beijing, just 1 hour out of Beijing into Hebei or Henan, Hebei, right? It's rows and miles of unoccupied properties. So you know what they're doing with all that excess housing? They just tear it down. New housing, they simply just tear it down because there's so much unoccupied housing. Some estimate that there are about 60 to 70 million. You can move every person in Britain to China, and every person, adult, woman, child would have housing. Europe's housing crisis would be solved right away. They all just move to China. So they've got this debt. So all these structural problems: too little consumption, over reliance on investment, leading to overcapacity and deflation, which I will talk about later, and excessive levels of debt going to the wrong things, right? Especially real estate. Then during the pandemic, that's when they became increasingly seized by this idea that competition is increasingly about technology, and whoever controls or achieves dominance in these technologies of the future would have geostrategic advantage. So that's when they started, coining terms like new quality productive forces. And at the same time, right, they realized that there were these long-standing problems, right? So how do you transition from an economy which is very debt-driven, has got too much investments going to real estate, to one which is characterized by technology, innovation, and productivity, right? So they decided to do it by, let's crack down on those sectors and industries which don't fit into their vision of the future, the techno-utopian vision of the future. So guess who are the victims of all these various crackdowns? Even a tech company also kena, right? So, but before we talk about Alibaba, the first sector they went after was actually real estate, right? Because they said this is just wasteful, right? We don't need all this real estate, it is a source of the debt bubble, right? Chinese households are, clearly speculating, and Xi Jinping had this famous line in 2018, 房子是来住的，不是来炒的, right? You may say that, but that's not how Chinese people think, right? And so the motivation was, in a sense, understandable, maybe even valid, right? All these investments in real estate is clearly speculative at best, at worst, incredibly wasteful. So what did they do? Nothing wrong with the motivation, but the way they intervened was very crude. Certainly not like Singapore's government, right, which is always very targeted and very measured, right? So they said, right, if these property developers, failed the 3 red lines, essentially debt ratios, capital ratio, debt ratio, you must hold enough cash ratio, right? You cannot borrow anymore. Basically, it cut off virtually every major property developer from financing. Basically, it says, you go and figure out how you want to solve how you want to raise capital, how you want to raise cash. And that essentially made them bankrupt, many of them bankrupt overnight. Anybody's been to Johor Bahru and visited Country Garden, Bihui Yuan, right? That is clearly a manifestation of this crackdown on property developers, right? They couldn't raise debt anymore. And so you're forced to sell at fire sale prices. So that led to a collapse of asset prices, a collapse of China's property bubble, led to a worse, they didn't imagine how bad it would become. But it's become really very bad. I mean, later I'll show you a chart. Chinese property prices have fallen by about 30% and maybe more, right? Over the last 2.5, 3 years. China's property debt crisis has lasted longer than the subprime mortgage crisis, which caused the global financial crisis in 07, 08. Right? That one lasted about 2 years. Chinese property prices have still not stabilized. They've fallen by more than 30, maybe even 40% over the last 3 years. So that was the first sector. You can see how it's driven by utopianism, right? That this is not how households should be using their savings. This is not how we, as a country, we want capital to be going. We want it to be going to, right, these techno gizmos of the future, not useless real estate. So, right, very utopian, almost social engineering. Right? Utopianism and social engineering are 2 sides of the same coin, isn't it? Right? You have a utopian vision of the future, and then you're very driven by, we want households, we want individuals, we want citizens to behave, right, in accordance with those utopian visions. And clearly property investments didn't fit those imaginations. Right? So then the second sector is consumer tech. Not technology companies, they still value technology, but consumer tech. Why? Because then consumer tech is not particularly useful. It leads to overspending, it leads to consumption binges. So they went after, it leads to regulatory problems, right? How companies like Alibaba use data. So they don't like fintech, they don't like P2P lending, but they like EVs, they like cloud computing, they like AI, they like facial recognition. So it's a very, very almost moralistic view of, yeah, what do you say?
Childish.
Almost childish, right? Like very parental, all these Chinese people using, why are you wasting your time and money on games? So they even call gaming spiritual opium. Yeah. I know anybody who knows anything about Chinese history will know that, right? 精神鸦片 is the worst thing you can be called, right? So they went after Alibaba, Tencent, mostly a social media and gaming company, and that just destroyed confidence in the Chinese economy, right? So you can see how this techno-utopianism had very, at best dramatic, at worst drastic consequences, right? Unintended consequences, maybe intended, I don't know, but unintended consequences on confidence, consumer confidence, business. So in 2022, when I wrote many of the essays in this book, that was really a very depressing period, right? Because everybody thought China had become uninvestable. It suddenly seemed to be cracking down on everything and everybody. And after the consumer tech companies, they went after even the tuition industry, private education.
How much money people spend
on tuition, right? And they just killed that. And not just how much money people spend on tuition, but also how much capital was destroyed as a result of that. And now, of course, tuition has its negative effects. We know that very well in Singapore, right, or Hong Kong. But for many people, this was their primary way of getting good quality education. If you live in the countryside, you live in a third-tier city, schools are not particularly good. Many of these private education companies were very innovative in the way they delivered. And you know, the Chinese education system is very competitive. So if you don't get a good education, there's no way you can compete. And tuition was, private education was a kind of equalizer. Yeah, of course, there's other negative consequences. Also, it created too much stress, anxiety. Now, why did the Chinese authorities go after the private education? You think, why would you be so bull-headed, right? Why would you go attack something so innocent, right? Again, utopianism, right? Xi Jinping blamed the education system for China's falling fertility rate. Right? So in 2022, when China's population first year started declining, they look for quick fixes, right? And it's very easy to pick on scapegoats, right? So utopianism is also causes, besides social engineering, scapegoating. You look for easy targets, right? So they introduce something called this double. Chinese policy always characterized, there's always a number in front one. One child policy, zero COVID, double reduction. It's very, very utopia. It's like, wow, you can see this engineer's mind at work, right? You just put the number there and makes the policy very precise. But it can be precisely wrong. You can have a very precise policy, but precisely wrong. And precisely, has very negative effects. So yeah, 2022 was truly depressing. A lot of people, Chinese hedge fund owners said China had become uninvestable. And that's when I thought, wow. And on top of that, economists in China don't quite dare to say it. Because at the same time, they were telling economists, please do not spread negative stories. 要把中国的故事讲好，讲好的中国故事。
Lose their job.
Yeah, you lose your job. And somebody did lose their job. Some economists. So my father sent me a message. Yeah, are you going to lose your job? No, not in China. I'm nobody, right? This is a professor. Who was?
3 years ago, you can lose your head.
In China, you might even lose your head, right? You lose your freedom. So it's been 3 years long. I've stopped. I've given up updating this chart already. These slides, because every month there is more bad news. For 3 years, actually it's unthinkable. And at one level, you can say that the Chinese economy is very resilient, right? Despite 3 years of property debt, property price declines of 30, 40, and then Chinese households have about, on average, 70% of their savings tied up in housing. Imagine 70% of your savings losing 40% of value. Basically, your savings have lost 1/3 of their, close to 30% of their value, right? It has not led to a more systemic financial crisis. It's actually quite remarkable. I don't know how they managed to pull it off. So I stopped bothering to update this because it's just too depressing to read.
The Taiwanese always say all the bad things, but until today still okay.
About what?
The Taiwanese always say bad things about China.
About the Chinese economy.
For the last 20, 30 years. But until today still never materialized. Still okay.
No. My favorite example is Gordon Chang, right? Back in the early 2000s, he wrote this book, The Coming Collapse of China. He's still talking about the coming collapse of China. So I don't buy into this very, overly pessimistic. There is a great deal of resilience, and the Chinese economy has many sources of growth, not least in some of these high-tech sectors. So I don't buy into this, that the Chinese economy will collapse in a matter of, a few years. So that's the second argument or the second observation I make about China's tech utopianism. Yeah, this is the chart. On consumer, so this is China's housing prices. It's fallen it's been negative territory since around middle of 2022. So that's about 2.5, it's nearly 3 years. I also want to show this red line. This is all Chinese data from Chinese sources. What do you think is this source of this drop in consumer confidence?
The Great Lockdown.
That's right, the Shanghai lockdown. You might think it's COVID, right? But this is COVID, early 2020. Right? But it rebounded very quickly because China, as I say in my book, right? China quickly seized control of the spread of COVID. And within a few months, consumer confidence, and then for more than nearly a year and a half. Life in China, Sanjay, you in Shanghai then or Beijing? You just come back already.
It was back and forth. I got 4 or 5 quarantines in between.
So you're traumatized. Still suffering from PTSD. So yeah, but otherwise life in China seemed pretty normal, right? No mask, domestic tourism boom, economy expanded by 9%, I think 9 to 10% in 2021, the year after COVID, the start of COVID. And then the Shanghai lockdown. And look at what consumer confidence has been since. It hasn't really recovered. Consumer confidence today is as low as it was during the depths of the Shanghai lockdown. I mean, whenever I talk to these China apologists, they say, oh, things are doing fine, they're good. I just said, you're talking out of your ass, just look at this. Right? Things clearly in the minds of consumers, things are pretty grim. Right? The property slump has been much longer than expected. There's a great deal of deleveraging. People aren't spending. Right? And so deflationary pressures are incredibly stubborn. They're still grappling with deflation. China has been in deflation for about 3 years now. And then on top of that, as a result of all these crackdowns, my retirement savings have been impaired. This is my, at the end of 2020, I made a bet with my grad school classmate. At the end of 2020, I was you know how did China gain control of COVID at the early stage? They had this thing called the health code, right? It's like our it's like our trace together, but better, right? And more intrusive, that's why I say better, right? And who created this health code? Alibaba and Tencent. Yeah, Alipay, and they use data from Alipay and Tencent, WeChat Pay, right? And then you'll be issued green, yellow, or red, each corresponding to different level of restrictions. Green, no restriction. So at the end of 2020, I said these companies are so important to their fight against COVID. How can they fail? So I made a bet with my American grad school classmate. I said, we'll bet the same amount of money, right? And it must be substantial to put our money where our mouth is. So I'll bet on Alibaba and Tencent. You pick your two American tech companies. He was very bullish about America. So he picked Nvidia and Apple. And then pissed off, lor. He's now in Bahamas sailing in his yacht. I'm here doing this. Very resentful.
This
right?
is life.
Huh?
This is life.
This is life, right? Yeah. I mean, even now, right? So last year there was a recovery, but even now it's still about 40% down. At my depths of despair in 2022, I was down by about 70%. Imagine losing 70% of your, and I'm actually okay because I don't own real estate in China. I just own Alibaba shares, right? And Tencent shares. Imagine if you're a Chinese resident, right? You cannot easily take your money out. Your investments are all, or your savings are in Chinese property or companies like this. Would you dare to spend? Right? You'll be so depressed, right? Animal spirits would be so negative. And it's not just companies like Alibaba, other tech companies, right? Even the ones that the Chinese state is trying to promote, like EVs, they have also, followed a very similar trend. They're still down by about 40%. So, and on top of that, venture capital, the venture capital industry has been, terribly affected. Some would say decimated. Look at before COVID, before 2020, China's venture capital industry was very vibrant. Every year, more than $100 billion dollars of funds in US dollars. Then in 2022, it virtually just disappeared. Right? And then a few months later, Xi Jinping even asked, where are the unicorns? Right? Well, the short answer, if his officials are brave enough, say, well, you killed them. Presidency, you killed them. That's what happened to our unicorn. So then in the last 2 years, this techno-utopianism has been even more emphasized, right? So it's this, it's like, who cares about the short-term pain, right? The cyclical weak household growth. For a while, Xi Jinping even said, what's wrong with deflation? Aren't households better off with deflation? What he doesn't realize is that deflation is caused by overcapacity. Deflation is caused by weak domestic demand and households, not opening their wallets. So they're doubling down rather than trying to address the demand side of issues. They're in fact doubling down on supply, right? On investing in these technologies and industries of the future. So they prioritize investments in new quality productive forces, and they reject any suggestion, at least in 2024, that there was overcapacity in China. Why do you think they rejected? Because the term overcapacity was used by people like Janet Yellen, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, right? When they visited China in 2024, they highlighted their concerns with overcapacity. So immediately, once any Western politician criticizes China, that is like the kiss of death, right, for their criticism. Right, in 2024, they were busy, the Chinese authorities were busy denying that there's any excess capacity. Right? So that's another expression, another manifestation of this techno-utopianism. A kind of denialism that there is problems, right? Because you're so seized by your utopian ideas, you kind of cannot accept, at least for a while, that there's anything wrong with your, that your efforts are creating any problem. And this is the world's most famous China apologist, Jeffrey Sachs, right? Rejects US claims of Chinese overcapacity. He says they're absolutely wrong. So in 2024, there are a few pieces there where I talk about China's overcapacity. A couple of my colleagues, well-meaning, they said, maybe you shouldn't use the term overcapacity. It's very toxic, right? It's very sensitive. Right? Maybe you find some other term. So I know, economists will just use excess supply or overcapacity. But then in 2025, what happened? The Chinese authorities themselves kind of, right, admitted that there was overcapacity. Oh, now, of course, they're very careful not to use the term because it's become so sensitive, right? So they appropriated this term from the Chinese population. Nature had become quite a well-used term by then. So they said there's nature. As an economist, why don't you just call a spade a spade? Why must you create? You're not the first country in the world to experience overcapacity. Why don't you just call a spade a spade? Meanwhile, people like Jeffrey Sachs have gone very quiet. So now there's this fan nature, right? Anti-involution campaign. Companies are told not to engage in price wars. Effectively, they're setting price floors, right? Preventing prices from falling. And actually, from any of you who studied a bit of economics, will know that actually prolongs the problem, right? Because it makes the excess supply. You prevent prices from falling. And how are companies going to?
Then they still cannot sell.
Yeah, they still cannot sell, right? The problem is weak demand. The problem is not that prices. That firms are cutting their prices, right? So companies have to find all sorts of ways to get around these. So things like that, or they drive their cars, new cars, for 100 kilometers and sell them as second hand, right, at much lower prices. So go get the BYD. So I wrote there's this chapter there. Why do people like Jeffrey Sachs keep getting it wrong, right? By the way, in Singapore, we have our own China booths also. Why do they? Because they simply echo, right? And then when the Chinese authorities make 100% turn, whether it's going from zero COVID to COVID for everyone at the start of 2023, or going from there's no overcapacity to now saying, let's stop this nature, right? That's fun nature. It's 180 degrees. So that's why these China booths are caught out, right? And the Chinese authorities can speak out of two sides of their mouths, over a very short space of time. They're caught by surprise. Right? So then, I didn't cover the last point in this book, but obviously since the book came out, actually I'm very thankful the book came out in early 2025, before Trump and his tariffs, right? Because that's taken on now everybody just talks about how China has already won the trade wars, right? So I'm very glad that the book came out before, because that will take the book into a whole new direction. So So anyway, but my view of the tariffs is it probably worsens a little China's economic malaise, but it's not the main driver. Right? If you've been following this talk up till now, you realize that most of China's problems are made in China. They're not made by the US, they're not caused by the US. The tariffs probably accentuate some of those, but it's not the main. For better or for worse, China's, or rather, let me put it this way, China's success or failure is not going to be determined by the US. Right? It's only primarily going to be determined by their own policies. And China's techno-utopianism is both highly promising as well as potentially self-destructive, or at least potentially harmful to China itself. Now the authorities accept that there's excess capacity, there's involution, that deflation is a problem, but they don't really have the tools to deal with it. They have had this trade-in subsidies, right? So, but how many trade-in subsidies can you do? After you buy a new smartphone, a new fridge, a new car, you're not going to buy another one for several years. I mean, it's not like CDC vouchers, so you can keep Every year we can keep pumping, stimulating the economy. They don't have that, and they're very reluctant to do that. Partly because of regional inequality, right? If let's say the Chinese authorities say, let's give you their similar something like CDC voucher, everybody gets 2,000 yuan a year, right? That would be too little for somebody in Shanghai, and a lot for people and somebody in Guangxi or Jilin. Right? But if they differentiate it by province, they will have a political crisis on their hands. Right? Because why should Shanghainese get more? They already paid more. Why should they get more consumption subsidy? So that's holding them back. Right? This lack of bureaucratic precision, right, or capacity to calibrate the right amount of subsidies. I'm also worried about impacts on other, less so developed countries. Developed countries will find their own ways, right, to cope with it. But one of the funniest headlines I saw last year was in Europe, solar panels are becoming a garden fencing option because they become cheaper than concrete. I mean, you can just look at this picture. Right? Nobody is meant to use solar panels like that, right? They're not going to catch any sunlight. Oh, who cares? It's cheaper than right what you normally use for. Right? Even steel. So it's not just the new industries that has a great deal of overcapacity. Traditional industries like steel, there's a great deal. Every Chinese steel producer is awash in losses, right? And globally, there's too much steel production, right, and aluminum production. I'm more worried about impacts on developing countries, and particularly our neighborhood, right, which is just battered. Singapore is a bit, not entirely protected, but we are a bit more sheltered because we operate at a much higher value added level. But we can see it, right, in F&B, okay, thank goodness we don't have car producers, which will be, European car producers are being battered. But for Southeast Asian producers or Southeast Asian countries, the economy is more or less the same level of development as China. So if you're producing plastic, household items, furniture, steel, right, many of these traditional manufacturing industries, how are you going to compete with this juggernaut that has so much overcapacity that is exporting it abroad? Right? So threat of deflation is clearly something that we have to worry about. And there's a piece there in the book also that talks about how very early on I said that China's drive for industrial dominance, to control, to be self-sufficient, and to lead in these industries of the future, that's actually going to hurt other developing countries that are also trying to industrialize, as well as China itself, because where's the demand coming from? It's going to amplify deflationary pressures. And once deflationary pressures get locked in, it tends to be self-reinforcing, because if you expect prices to fall in the future, you're going to hold back on spending. If firms expect prices to continue falling, they're going to hold back on new investments and on hiring. So it is then, and then when firms and households are not spending, not investing, that fuels even more deflation. So let me end on this chart. So what I'm always asked this at the end by my students, by anybody I speak to, what will it take for China to recover, both in the short and medium term? The short-term challenges are both obvious, but also very difficult to address because they're all interconnected, and there are many of them. There's the property slump, right? There's persistent deflation pressures due to overcapacity. There's too much reliance on investment, not enough stimulus to consumption. So one way to think about the short-term challenges is the 4 Ds, right? They have a great deal of debt that's causing a lot of deleveraging, right? Paying off debt, which means too little consumption and too little investment. So that's contributing to deflation, the 3rd D. And that's driving asset price declines. And then there's actually the 5th D, which is a long-term challenge. Very bad demographics. This is the greatest depopulation we've seen in history. China's population is expected to halve between now and the end of this century, from just under 1.4 billion to about 650 million. That's a huge population decline, right? no human society, even Japan never saw that speed of population.
Only major wars can reduce the population.
Even major, yeah, still even taking into account major wars.
But that took hundreds of years.
That's right.
It's not
Over the 100-year war in Europe. Yeah. So, and their response to all this bad news is not let's take it by its horns, let's engage in structural reform, let's stimulate consumption in a sustained way. Their response is things like that, right? In order to tell stats providers not to publish so much data on falling house prices. So it's this very controlling, right? Social engineering mindset to your bad news. Let's try to stem the release of bad news. Let's try to contain it rather than solve the roots of the problem. As I said, deflationary expectations and stuff. I never thought I'll see this in my adult life. I started studying economics in 18, 19, right? And even then, in the 90s, you could tell that Japan's inflation rate and therefore its bond yields inflation rates and bond yields go in lockstep, have always been lower than other developed countries and much lower than developing countries like China. Because developing countries tend to have higher inflation rates and therefore higher bond yields. China's long-term yields are now below Japan's. Right? So long-term yields are indication of a few things. First, it's an indication of future inflation expectations. So if long-term yields are very low, it means that people buying Chinese bonds are saying inflation 10 years from now will be very low. That means long-term expectations are very pessimistic. It's not just in the next 1 year, 2 years, we think that China will still have a deflation problem. So people are buying Chinese bonds at what, 3%, right? Why should a developing country have such low long-term inflation expectations? That is really a sign of, right, very entrenched pessimistic expectation. On top of that, I even talked about local government finances. They are in terrible shape, right? The national average, and this is just debt that is on their books, on the local government books. Local governments have a lot of ways of hiding debt. Right? There are these things called local government financing vehicles, LGFVs. God knows how much debt they have. But those that are on local government books, on average, is about just over 50%, right? About 60%. But some, like Guizhou, my favorite example of a local government that has gone out of whack, has got just government debt, local government debt of more than 150% of Guizhou's GDP. I've been reading some really fascinating stories about Guizhou. Guizhou has 47 of the world's 100 highest bridges. So it's building these massive bridges at 2,000 feet, 2,000 meters above sea level. Partly it's because Guizhou is a very mountainous province, but you have also said this is not a rich province. What are these bridges connecting? Right? Not particularly active or vibrant urban centers. Probably connecting one town to another town that's depopulating.
You know why?
Why?
Because they are Chinese saying, 要想富先修路.
Or to get rich, you have to first build a road, right? Yeah. So Guizhou is in a rush
Because
to
they
get
are
rich.
poor, you have to build the road first.
To show that, right, that you're hitting all these.
If not, you will continue to be poor.
You continue to be poor.
Yeah.
Guizhou is only known for one thing that is worth buying. What is that? Correct. But actually the best indicator of Chinese confidence is multi prices. The value of my multi portfolio has fallen by as much as my Alibaba. Why is that? Why is that?
Crack down on banquets.
Crack down on serving multi at banquets. So not that I used to go to China for banquets, but the few banquets I attended, multi was freely served. Now I'm told no more such nonsense. In a way, it's a good thing, right? But on the other hand, it also kind of you're hurting.
Multi coffee now.
There's multi coffee, right? And there's multi cocktails also. One of the worst things I've had.
Ice cream.
Yeah. So every barometer I've looked at is telling a pretty grim story. The other wonderful story, not wonderful, actually quite tragic. There's this city, it's called a city in Guizhou called 六盘水. 你听过吗？六盘水. It's in the middle of Guizhou, somewhat elevated, but not particularly, doesn't get much snow. and the party secretary there decided to turn Liupanshui into a ski resort. They went to borrow like more than $1 billion US. This is a small city, no more than 1 million people, right? $1 billion going to us. Who goes to Guizhou for skiing? Have you ever thought that Guizhou is so southern, right? So yeah, so that obviously the party secretary lost his job, arrested for corruption. I don't know what's happened to him, but they're saddled with this unsustainable debt. This poor city, right, that they had to service for God knows how long. So in end of 2024, the Chinese central government issued bonds, right, with a view of taking over local government debt. That is probably a step in the right direction, but the size of the bond issuance is too small, right, given the scale of this local government debt problem. And these are just the short-term challenges. We haven't even talked about the long-term challenges. So very quickly, the long-term challenges. Okay, so as part of this techno-utopianism, they want to double their GDP, Chinese GDP, from 2020 level to 2035. So that means growing at about 6%, just over 5%, nearly 6% a year. Probably not doable, right? Because even in the early phase, you're barely hitting 5%, and everybody expects growth to slow to about 3.5% by the end of this decade. So probably not doable. On top of that, they want to do this without, increasing the share of consumption, which is how most other countries do it. They want to keep. There's no deliberate effort to try to raise. They say we want to boost consumption, but there are no specifics. They say now raising consumption is a priority, but they don't have the mechanisms to do it, right? And also because the public finance is quite stretched. Where are you going to raise the money to do so? So they want to do it not by boosting consumption or raising consumption share of GDP, but they want to do it through techno-utopianism, right? As long as we dominate the technologies and industries of the future, we can achieve our GDP target. I'm very doubtful. I'm an economist, so I'm not one of those people who think, oh, technology is the answer to every economic problem. But Chinese leaders tend to think like that. Whatever is the question, the answer is technology. I think that's quite a simplistic way of thinking about it. They also don't want to increase the debt burden. If anything, they want to deleverage. So that also means that debt cannot be a continuing source of growth and a continuing source of investment. And they're trying to do this at a time of severe demographic decline. Right? I'm sure you have heard the data from 2025. It is horrific. In 2024, there are about 9.2 million births. In 2025, it fell to 7.9. That level of decline is unheard of. In 2024, population declined by about 2 million, just under 2 million. Last year, it declined by nearly 3.4 million. So not only is population declining, it is declining at an increasing rate. So some scary, depending on how you look at it, potentially scary data. By China's China is already an older population than the US. Right? China's median age is already higher than the US. Probably by the end of this decade or early part of 2030s, China will be an older society than the EU. I mean, when we think of the EU, we think it's aging, it is, right? But China is going to be older than the EU by the early 20s. By 2050, China will be older than Japan. By 2070, there will be more elderly people in China than there are working people. Right? So yeah, I know I don't agree with the view that demography is destiny, but when your demographic decline is so severe, I cannot imagine it being a good thing.
Unless they have inward immigration.
Yeah, which is, the numbers we are talking about is not plausible, right? I mean, Singapore is only possible because, and even in a small society like Singapore, people are screaming, right? So you can imagine.
You will have all the robots to replace people.
Yeah.
Workforce.
So up to a point, technology is the answer. So in this case, actually, technology is indeed the answer to the. So yeah, I think at one level, it does improve people's lives, right? It does increase productivity, the widespread deployment of robots, not just industrial robots, but also increasingly household robots. So that is the big unknowable.
Wouldn't that mean the revenue is concentrated in the
Hands of the absolutely. There's more inequality. And China is already a very unequal economy. It's one of probably the most unequal major economy. You might think, oh, the US, surely the US is more unequal. Actually, no. Look at, say, spatial inequality, right? The gap between, say, somebody who lives in New York, New York's GDP per capita is about 100,000, and Louisiana, right, a typical poor southern state, is about 50,000. So it's 2 times. Right? It's 2 times. In China, in Shanghai, it's about what, 30,000 GDP, but close to 30,000. In my favorite Guizhou, right, it's 8,000. So that's like 2.5 times. Actually, no, 3.5 times. 3.5 times. So China is actually way more unequal. And there isn't talk about, oh, let's create a much more equalizing, much more egalitarian welfare state. There's no language even to talk about welfare state reform.
The local government debt is making it worse.
Yeah, exactly. So the local governments, instead of stimulating the domestic economy, are going after sources. You know, they're essentially implementing contractionary fiscal policy because they have to finance themselves. Now, China is not a federal system like the US, right? China is actually a unitary system, right? With unitary systems, you expect a lot more fiscal redistribution. But surprisingly, in China, there's very little fiscal redistribution. The provinces essentially have to finance themselves. Local governments actually have to finance.
Provinces like Jiangsu and Shanghai increasing pensions.
Yeah.
So the pensions is pegged to current pay, and they increase the pension.
Yeah, because they are
And you've got other provinces that they cannot even pay
the basic pension.
The
Current,
employees, not even pensioners.
right. So their pension systems are in the poorer provinces are extremely underdeveloped. And so you can imagine why Chinese households, even if you're living in the city but not in a particularly prosperous city or province, you will scrimp and save rather than open your wallets, right? Because you can't rely on the state to perform the things that we would expect a normal developed welfare system to deliver. Okay, I think that's all I had. Yeah, so Yulian has copies of both the English and Chinese version. I'll be happy to sign your copy if you want. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take some questions.
How long do you think it will take for the property
Yeah.
market?
So 2 years. So questions like that are very dangerous. As in, colleagues are lousy. I already gave you evidence, ample evidence of my lousy investment choices decisions. Right? So 2 years ago, I said by 2025 it should have stabilized. It should stabilize, but I've been proven wrong. So in the case of Japan, it took them nearly 20 years for falling asset prices to. It took them 30 years for the Nikkei to get back to its pre-1990 peak. So I don't think China will be in such a long, because it's still a developing country with plenty of growth engines. But anything more than 5 years, I think is too much for property slump.
Chinese data sources, resale property prices are now back to 2016 levels. So if you bought after Q2 2016, you're at most.
Wow.
10 years.
Assume they win the technology competition.
Yeah.
Assume the successful in AI.
Yeah.
And robot,
Very safe
everything,
very safe
self-driving.
Very
So
good
would that
question.
be a good thing to the unemployment or bad thing? Because you don't need people.
Yeah, even without massive AI disruption, their youth unemployment is already 16%. And that's one of the paradoxes. Right? Why do they have all these, incredibly innovative, world-beating tech companies, but they're not hiring young? I mean, my poor students really struggle to get jobs.
Yeah, and China is with a very, very famous history of a revolution. So
Yeah.
every couple of years, 100 of years.
It is
100
recorded,
years.
recorded analysis. Yeah, but where would to organize a revolution? The Chinese state is very strong, right? At least in terms of suppressing.
Soviet also very strong.
Yeah, but Soviet, it was internal, as C would like to say, it's really internal stresses and fractures within the Soviet Communist Party that caused the demise of the Soviet Union. China is clearly nowhere near the state of dysfunction. It's still, you believe official statistics, it's still growing about 5%. So they still have the means to turn it around and the resources to make sure that not a significant percentage of the population goes into abject poverty, so much so they will revolt. So I don't think the Soviet collapse scenario I mean, it's a scenario, it's a plausible scenario, but it's not my central scenario. My central scenario is actually Japanification,
Okay.
like maybe a decade of sluggish
Fatigue.
growth, fatigue, exhaustion, right? They've lost their mood. But yeah, you might say, oh, but Japan didn't have all these world-beating tech companies. Says who? Throughout the last decades, Japanese tech companies, manufacturing companies, were still globally competitive. Yeah. Right? Toyota, Mitsubishi Corp, Sony, yeah, in the 90s, 2000, Hitachi. Yeah, I mean, they were Toshiba. They were still, for most of the last decades, were still globally competitive. So that's my central scenario for China. A prolonged period of not negative growth or zero growth, but sluggish growth, falling asset prices, debt deleveraging, stubborn deflationary pressure. Yes.
And most of the Chinese people are already accustomed to that
slow-
expectation.
Yeah. Talking about Chinese society, it's very similar to Japanese society made in the early 2000s, right? What do you think Tang Ping is? Right, it's a kind of like, in Japan, what they had a term also, right, where people don't get married, they just stay over there. They lead very minimalist lives. Yeah, so
Something of desire, negative desire or something.
yeah, that's right. I think there's a book waiting to be written about how Chinese society has very interesting parallels with both in societal and social norms, as well as in terms of macroeconomics, with the Japan of the with the second half of the 1990s, all the way to the early 2010s.
Yeah, I have a question regarding, if let's say China, they want to raise the income per capita,
Yeah.
so maybe reach to, I don't know,
20,000.
Singapore level to a
Yeah.
developed country level. I think that's the goal.
Yeah. So that is the goal, right?
What needed to be done?
So yeah,
Or what they didn't get it right at this moment?
yeah, so that's the goal. They want to get to 20,000,
Yeah.
and they're going to drive it through all this through an investment-led model. They don't see any need to change the underlying structure of the economy. I think it will fall short. Right? No major economy, certainly not of China's size, can get to a developed country state, or at least comfortably above developed. The threshold is about 15,000 US dollars GDP per capita, without having a normal economic structure where domestic consumption, household plus government, is at least 50+%. Currently, it's 40 only. Singapore can do that. I mean, Singapore, the other economy which has a very low level of consumption is Singapore. It's like China, 40+%. But Singapore is very unusual, right? I mean, we can run trade surpluses of 20% of GDP and nobody notices. But when Chinese trade surplus is only about 4% of GDP, and the world is already screaming bloody murder. So China cannot replicate the small East Asian economies like Singapore or even Taiwan, right? So even Taiwan has had to shift to, after the 1990s, has had to shift to a more consumption-led, or South Korea did the same, Japan did it earlier. So I think that's unavoidable for China. And the fact that they're not thinking deliberately, I mean, they talk about boosting consumption, but it's always very short-term. Right? They don't see it as a structural issue. And the fact that they don't see it as a structural issue is a source of concern, because if you don't think about it as a structural issue and you're not thinking about how do we raise consumption sustainably, then what you tend to have is consumption binges or bubbles, like going to real estate, like stock market speculation, right? So you have to be very deliberate about this. And how do you do it, right? You take something like, let's construct a more comprehensive welfare system. Let's give people the confidence to spend. How do you do that? Higher pension, better healthcare, insurance, better education at all levels, particularly in second, third tier cities as well as the countryside. Then people don't feel the urge to engage in such high levels of precautionary saving. So in that sense, China has to undergo, has to go through what Europe went through.
But why they're not doing that?
Yeah, don't know actually. You would imagine you would imagine a country that calls itself socialist to embrace this, right? This is what socialism means, right? To build a comprehensive social welfare system that looks after everybody. So it is a bit of a mystery. So when they talk about common prosperity, by the way, when was the last time we heard about common prosperity? Not much. So there was a lot of fanfare about common prosperity in 2021. And then it didn't herald this, construction of the things that would actually deliver common prosperity. So my guess is they are very reluctant to do redistribution. And then in which case, how do you achieve common prosperity? Right? Maybe the companies themselves would have to.
How do you think if they go after Alibaba is a redistribution?
It's a kind of.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in which case
Maybe
it's very
industry
myopic,
by
right?
industry.
By killing industries. How is that? One of the pieces says by doing that, what you're doing is not promoting common prosperity, you're promoting common poverty. Where everybody gets poor. How does making Jack Ma poorer by a few $billion, how does that help Lao Baixing?
Isn't it instructive?
Yeah, that they would.
Instructive that they are doing it to Alibaba. Why do you think they do that?
Anything, it also brings down consumption, because if I've invested a huge
Yeah.
amount in that,
My
and
savings
it
are
was wiped out, it's not going to encourage me to spend.
exactly.
At the end of
So-
the day,
so it's-
control, isn't it?
At best, I'll say that it is ill-conceived, right? That this is not the way you go about regulating or regulating these companies or achieving. It's ill-conceived. You are suggesting it's actually maybe it's deliberate, right? I don't think it's deliberate. I think they have not had thought it through a few steps ahead, or maybe they've not consulted me yet, right? Actually, you just talk to Singapore, right? All these things we have kind of figured out, right?
Our consumption is still very low.
Yeah, true, but yeah, okay.
But I think if China go down this path, the deflation, evolution, what impact for Singapore? You benefit from that, or you getting impact from that?
I don't have a good answer to that. It's a very good question. In some areas, we will be clear beneficiaries. Certainly, the household robots, drones, all this will help our labor shortages, our aging workforce. So at the level of consumer welfare, I think Singapore is a winner from all these Chinese innovations. At a strategic level, I'm not so sure. Right? Maybe we'll be forced to, the choice between, assuming that alongside all these Chinese innovations, the pressures for decoupling also are amplified. Right, so we are forced. Then the choice becomes stark. See, if they weren't making all this tremendous progress, and we are made to choose, no problem, right? But it is precisely they're making all this impressive progress, and at the same time, there's more pressure for us to pick a side. Or even if you don't pick a side, if there's the technology decoupling, you have to choose. Even if you don't want to, right? You have to choose. Do you want to comply with Chinese standards, tech standards, or do you want to abide or comply with Western tech standards? Right? Even if you don't want to choose, de facto, you are making a choice. So I'm not so sure that part will be net positive for Singapore. So yeah, we might be squeezed, right?
I want to mention Trump, that China, US is not responsible for what China does, right? But essentially now, I would say US is kind of being seen as a for China to double down on their vision of techno-utopianism.
And self-sufficiency and social engineering and all of that.
That's right. And then the other one is around kind of consumer-centered, which is probably the hardest to get out of. But do you think maybe making some tweaks to the hukou system would help?
Yeah, so part
really
of social security reform is indeed hukou reform. Right? Because one of the things that will give, so households in general save a lot, but rural households, people without hukou in the city save even more. Right? I mean, the average national savings rate of household saving is about 30%. Migrant labor saves, I think, more than that, 33 to 35%. So yeah, why? Because migrant labor has the least social security, the least confidence to spend, right? So that's totally understandable. On your earlier point, I had a response. I can't remember. What was your earlier point?
On the US,
precisely it is because they can right? Certainly in the public communications, they can pin the blame on the US for all of their challenges. That reduces pressure for them to make these difficult reforms. So whatever challenges China faces, they say, it's caused by the US. Right? We are facing this very complex, challenging external environment. So that kind of detracts people's attention away from the things that actually is well within China's control and ability, right? Whether it's hukou reform or social security expansion. So it becomes a convenient excuse for them not to engage in these domestic reform. Go ahead, sir.
I think you mentioned that they are trying to get out of the middle income
Yeah.
trap, right? So they want to double the GDP.
Yeah.
So
Technically, I think they already are no longer certainly, if not this year, it'll be next year, or in the next couple of years. Technically, they will no longer be middle income, right? Because middle income is about 14 to 15,000 US dollars GDP by using market exchange rate. They are already 14,000, right? So very close. So I don't think they will get into the middle income trap. But that doesn't mean their problems go away, right? Yeah.
but getting out of it, is it a higher priority compared to the rest of the other?
Oh yes, certainly.
So if
Certainly,
it is a
I mean the
higher-
main priority, right? The main priority is to become what they call this medium developed 小康社会, right?
become the high
Medium
income.
developed economy by 2035, where GDP per capita is roughly at the level of what Spain is today, right? 25,000 US dollar GDP per capita. So that is ambitious.
So if
That is
they,
ambitious.
they cross that, will you mean that a lot of the other problems will be lessened?
Yeah, that's a great question. My view is no, and also they probably will not.
Not necessarily will be
Yeah.
lessened, even with that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so a lot of things got to go.
Yeah, that,
in
you know, when we talk
tandem
about development, it's not just GDP growth, right, or GDP per capita growth. It is also other things, right? Equality, sense of security, what sociologists call ontological security, right? Yeah, and I think that they are thinking, the engineers thinking that all you need to is to build, right? Last time it was real estate, now it's high-speed rail and EVs, and that production on its own will drive you to become this medium developed economy. I think that one is extremely.
and it can trickle down. People to have more.
That's right, and you create high productivity jobs. Everybody will be right.
Be more willing to spend with a higher income.
I think this has a long history, date back to the first dynasty.
You mean
mentioned,
utopianism?
No, building for 100 or 1,000 years has always been like this.
I
Right?
think so.
You look at all the dynasties, you look at Sui dynasty, the Grand Canal,
Yeah.
that was for many thousand years to
Yeah.
benefit. So it's not now. They've been
Yeah.
doing that for thousands of years already. So when they build, they don't have to care about return. They don't look at ROE or ROI or whatever. They only look at what this will help in the future, and they cannot give you a figure because that's not how they think last time. You look at whatever the Han dynasty or whatever dynasty they have.
Yeah, look at the Great Wall, right? What returns does that produce?
There's no return.
But it's a legacy, right?
It is a
It's a
legacy.
culture.
It's a different way
Yeah.
of running.
Yes.
And also, I don't blame them for emphasizing investment for most of the last 40 over years, right? Reform and opening. Because if you look back at before, 100 years before 1978, they had nearly 100 years of
the
investment. Right? First you had
the
right, just right before was 30 years of, more than 20 years of Mao, which was marked by right, civil strife, under-investment, pulling back of investment. Then before that you had the Sino-Japanese War, and before that you had the warlord period. Capital was destroyed.
It started all the way 1840.
That's right, and there were
Or
rebellions.
1798 it started.
Right, you had
when they
domestic
closed the world.
rebellions, Taiping,
1798
and all
already
that.
started.
So you had 100 years of a very tumultuous 100 years where capital not only was not being created, was being destroyed. Right? So the emphasis on investment was totally correct. At least in the first 40 years of reform. But you can have too much of a good thing, and I think they've certainly hit the point.
You see from a historical point of view, then what is happening today is nothing. It's not a problem.
Yeah,
You have to see a long term.
we've never had this extent of Chinese depopulation. So you're building all this stuff.
They have it every time it's war.
Yeah, but not so much.
Three kingdoms, and after that, the 200 years, the total 300 population dropped 90%.
Right,
from the Han dynasty to the Sui dynasty, population dropped by 90%.
But the
90%, population drop.
But the war is not predetermined. This population decline is
it's the internal war.
Yeah, it's not as if they intended to have the war to kill off so many people, right?
The war was not so connected in the
But
past as
why
we
do you
now,
think the
so-
population declining is a bad thing?
I don't think it's a bad thing.
Yeah.
I don't think
Maybe
it's a bad
it's
thing.
a good thing.
I think it's a good thing if your economy is designed for it. Right? If your economy is designed, if you have thought about it, you say like this is how we design our pension system for a world of, right, where dependency ratios are, right? Yeah. If you have thought about how you make your pension system sustainable, you've thought about how you make healthcare sustainable and high quality, right, for a much older population, then it's fine. If you do the kind of things that Japan did, or Sweden did, or most of Western Europe did, and certainly what Singapore is trying to do now, it's survivable. Maybe even not just survivable, you can try. But they're not thinking about it. They're sleepwalking into a much older population, and that's what. Hey, thanks. That's what is worrying, right? That they are not thinking about how do we buttress, how do we strengthen our social security system, our economic systems in the face of rapid aging.
But why are you not thinking about it? I mean, they have the CCTP, they have.
So that's why I don't buy this argument that the Chinese are unusually long-term oriented. If you're really long-term oriented, you would have avoided this demographic crisis already.
Yeah, they
right?
could have
How
avoided
come
it also.
your one-child policy lasted so long? So I think my conclusion is, we want engineers to do certain things, right? But engineers should steer clear of. I leave the economics to economists. Right? And also look at zero COVID. Look, the name of the policy tells you it's designed by engineers. Really. Whether it's one-child policy or zero COVID or double reduction, you think that everything can be just manufactured and just rolled out and deployed and scaled.
It's dealing with humans.
Yeah, it's hubris. It's the hubris of the engineer.
It's very complex.
There's some things you want to engineer. You only want engineers to do, but many things like social policy, COVID policy, please get other disciplines to do. Population policy. Don't you know who designed China's one-child policy? He was a rocket scientist.
Really?
Yeah, go Google it. Who was the architect of China's one-child
The lady
policy?
who just died.
No, the guy is a gentleman. He's literally a rocket scientist. He thought that China's population trajectory can be brought down as safely as a rocket can be.
But this population thing is a worldwide thing, right?
No, but not at the rate that, right?
Unless
Not
you
at
go
the
to
rate that
India and Africa, every nation is not giving birth,
Yeah,
not getting married. USA is because of immigration.
So true.
Singapore is immigration.
But
Everywhere is
what
declining
is the
population.
cause of that policy inertia?
on
Yeah.
population.
Population, COVID, they have the stats.
Yeah,
they
then
have the
suddenly,
numbers,
right,
but
and then
they
suddenly
choose
you have to
not
go
believe
from-
in the numbers.
Yeah, this policy pendulum. I think because the system is very hierarchical, right? There's inadequate feedbacks,
Yes.
right? So the top decides on something, whether it's EVs or zero COVID. The top decides on something, then everybody has to implement with extraordinary zeal.
Just a
Even if you
basic-
think that this has gone too far, there's no mechanism to feedback to the top that, hey, 太过分了, right?
Oh,
And so
but-
you carry on doing, right?
By the time you feedback, it's too late.
By the time
Yeah.
feedback is too late, and then you have to wait for the guy at the top to finally realize
Yeah.
that this has gone too
And
far.
for such a big initiative, you need to build a vast system to reinforce. And over the time, the system has its self-interest.
Yeah.
So continue to reinforce by the self.
Yeah.
Many people are living on this one-child policy.
Oh yeah, certainly. That's another source of inertia, right? So local officials, the population officials at the local level, even though they had brought down the population growth by a lot, they were reporting fake births. Right? Why? Because they want to continue
Yeah.
getting resources from. They say,
Yeah.
"Oh, we still need."
No, I bet they'll be sacked, man, for failing their job. That's why they always fake data. No, in fact, information the world mostly is
Yeah,
fake.
if you can, don't catch all the mouse. You keep it a little bit.
Yeah.
I want to lose a job.
So now caught the chief of army guy.
So every policy will not
Yeah.
claim it's ready.
Yeah. So in other big countries, the solution to that problem, where you don't want decisions to be so centralized and concentrated, is to decentralize. So you have state governments, right? Whether it's Australia or the US or Europe, it's you want decisions to be made at the lowest level possible. But in China, there's too much mimicry, right?
You talk about demographic issue. I mean, Singapore is the same case. It's a small country, even that.
Or
You also
elections.
become
We cannot.
Or elections. One round of elections.
change
Very
the policy.
dangerous.
I think we have I mean, in terms of population problem, I think ours is worse than China.
No lah. Well, our total fertility rate is higher. not my Dutch, but it's higher. But the other thing is we are small and we can have
One
immigration.
of the lowest in the world is Taiwan.
Yeah,
Taiwan, South
oh, South Korea.
Korea.
Yeah, China is about
Singapore is quite low.
yeah 1.1, just over 1. China is 0. China is lower than ours now, no? Yeah, TFR. Good job, China. Okay, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much. Please support this our wonderful bookshop here. Thank you.